Well, it's begun. Every year I hear this argument, and every year it's just crap. The argument that Canada's somehow not getting Stanley Cups because the NHL doesn't want it, even though Winnipeg right now is in the second round on the verge of the third round, but the NHL wants that, I guess. It's just about jerking us around. And I put these up in a random order, so this is not indicative of anything. Toronto missed the playoffs from 2006 to 2013. They last won around in 2004. Right now they don't have a GM. It's probably going to be Mark Hunter. Could be Kyle Dubas. They could still psych us out and, hey, Kyle Dubas is the guy. But either way, the Leafs have been mismanaged for a long time, and they didn't have a really good management structure until Shanahan took over and the Shannon plan took effect. And even though they went out in the first round this year to Boston, Toronto is still on their way, I believe, to contendership and to potentially winning a Stanley Cup. The whole argument that somehow if Canada wins the Stanley Cup that it would make the head office angry in the NHL, and I've heard it for years, I've heard it for decades. It's so weird. If the Toronto Maple Leafs won a Stanley Cup, first off, Sportsnet and TSN would be off the air for a little while the male anchors scream and cheer and run around the offices yelling, throwing papers in the air. And then we would hear about it 24/7 until October. And it would draw huge ratings in Canada, which is where the NHL makes a lot of its money. Now, it's interesting too because this channel, most of my viewers are American. So there's that part of things with this channel. Edmonton last won a Stanley Cup in 1990. They had won 5 years out of 7. So the NHL wanted Canada to win then, or didn't want? Why would that have changed in the? Is it because Gretzky went down? Because they won again after Gretzky went to LA. So was that a mistake, or was that they missed 11 out of their last 12 attempts to make the playoffs? They were in the finals in 2006, where they got beat by Carolina. And yes, I was cheering for Carolina in that final, and I'm going to be completely honest. I hadn't anticipated it. I'm like, all right, I'm going to cheer for Edmonton. And then Carolina scored, and I cheered, and I went, crap. They were in the conference final in 91 and 92. They lost to Minnesota, and then they lost to Chicago. And I'm a Minnesota fan, so Minnesota North Stars. And their GM right now is Peter Chiarelli. So Oilers fans complain all the time about the GM. Did the NHL install a GM there meant to hold them down? Calgary's missed the playoffs 7 of the last 9 years. They were in the finals in 2004. They've had 1 second-round showing since then, and that was when they beat the Canucks, so that doesn't count. And I even said that back when they beat the Canucks, like, well, that doesn't really count because the Canucks are on their way down. The Flames right now, their core, you got to wonder, you got some questions about it. Their GM right now is Brad Treliving, and he seems like a good guy and a good GM, but they're still out of the playoffs, and they still seem to be spinning their wheels. Montreal, they've missed 2 of the last 3 Stanley Cup playoffs. They were in the conference finals in 2010 and 2014. Their GM is Marc Bergevin, who most Montreal fans want to see fired because he's made some questionable or flat-out bad moves. And he gave up Sergachev, who's on this Tampa Bay Lightning team that's already punched their spot in the Final Four. And he gave up Subban. And what did he get back? He got back Jonathan Drouin, who he felt would be a center and isn't. And he got back Shea Weber, who's old and past his prime. And this year he was injured. And that may very well be the storyline going forward. At some point, these defensemen that play 30 minutes a night and get beat up, eventually their body breaks down. Again, Montreal fans want to get rid of the GM. Vancouver's missed 4 of the last 5 years. They were in the finals in 2011. Game 7 against Boston. Yeah, Boston flat out won that. That Stanley Cup final, if you look at just total goals in the series, Boston beat the hell out of Vancouver for most of that series. But Luongo managed to steal some games and make it look closer than it really was. And their GM right now, Jim Benning, and depending on who you are, you either think he's doing an okay job or you think he's an idiot. And that seems to be the thought process. He's one or the other. And I've had both opinions over the last 4 years. I'll say, yeah. Basically, since he was hired, I felt good when he got hired because he was a scout out of Boston. And I thought, all right, well, he's a pretty good scout, and he is. His draft picks, he's had a lot of hits. He's had some first-round misses people talk about a lot, but he's had some hits in the later rounds. But is Vancouver anywhere near contending? No. Ottawa, they've missed 3 of the last 5 Stanley Cup playoffs. So we get romanticized with last year they went to the conference final and they almost knocked out Pittsburgh, but not quite. But now Erik Karlsson could very well be taking his ball and going home. By going home, I mean going somewhere else. Their GM is Pierre Dorion. Dorion is... I have my concerns with Pierre Dorion as GM, but you know what? His actual resume isn't long enough for me to make any huge decisions on whether or not I feel he's been really good. And whatever happens with Erik Karlsson will show his hand. And of course the Matt Duchene trade that happened this year, which many people felt was a bad move. And now they don't have their first rounder next year, and if they don't pull themselves out of where they're at, if they end up being a bottom feeder next year, Ottawa could very well have given these guys a top 3 draft pick. And finally, Winnipeg. So this is your only hope. Winnipeg. They've missed the playoffs 15 out of 18 seasons as a team. And that's including Atlanta because I need to look at the long-term picture for this. We don't know what's going to happen this year as I'm recording this. They're going into Game 7 on Thursday in Nashville. So we don't know what's going to happen there yet. Their GM, Kevin Cheveldayoff. I've had my concerns with him. I felt that he stands pat too much. But it's worked out for him now. So of the teams that are on the board, right now you can argue that Winnipeg's a contender. Toronto's going to be a contender. And none of the rest of them look like they're on any kind of a path towards being a contender. And then I've got Colorado on the board because the year that the Quebec Nordiques went to Denver, they won the Stanley Cup. And you could look at this as the ultimate example. See, the NHL wanted that. No. They went out and got Patrick Roy. These guys were stupid enough to decide Patrick Roy was past his prime and move him here. Because the Montreal Canadiens moved Patrick Roy, Montreal hasn't won a Stanley Cup since. It showed a lack of foresight. It showed a knee-jerk reaction to a situation that, Patrick Roy wasn't playing very well that year. Guess what? Montreal wasn't playing very well that year. And trading him completely changed that franchise's destiny. If they'd had Roy his entire career as a Montreal Canadian, who knows where they'd be right now? Who knows how many more Stanley Cups they would have won? I think they would have won at least one more with Patrick Roy, because his compete level was higher than any other goalie I've ever seen, which is not an insult to other goalies. It is a compliment to Patrick Roy. So this Stanley Cup in 96, if they'd been in Quebec, doesn't happen because Montreal doesn't trade Patrick Roy to the Quebec Nordiques. There's no chance. Now, would the Nordiques have won a Stanley Cup with that roster, minus Roy, with Jocelyn Thibault as the starter? We'll never know. And that's the trick. In order to claim that there's some kind of a huge conspiracy against Canadian teams, we would have to point out a Canadian powerhouse, a team that's built to win, that has questionable calls against them every year in the playoffs that cause them to lose. And we can look at disputed goals, but if you want to bring up disputed goals, there's some Sabres fans that would love to line up and talk about disputed goals in Stanley Cup playoffs. And there are any team that I would put on this board, and I'd say, hey, remember that disputed goal? And there would be fans that say, yeah, because there's always been disputed calls in the history of the league. So there you go. Eventually, I think either Toronto or Winnipeg gets the Stanley Cup. But you know what? With the way things turn around, how quickly things turn around, Edmonton can still get on there because they've got Connor McDavid. They've got Connor McDavid locked up for a very long time. And that's something that Canadian franchises haven't really had. That huge superstar that's almost bigger than the game. The Oilers had Gretzky, which got them 4 of their 5 Stanley Cups, and they had Messier for that 5th. Montreal had Patrick Roy. Vancouver's never won it. Ottawa's never won it. Winnipeg's never won it. Toronto's streak of not making it goes back to 1967. And for Calgary, Those Calgary Flames had Al McInnes on that blue line, and they had one hell of a deep team, fantastic team, and Lanny McDonald in his retirement year. They won that one for Lanny. So that's all it is to me, is that the NHL clearly doesn't care who wins the Stanley Cup. I know people are going to be like, yes, they do, but they don't. Because if we want to argue, well, they got the Pittsburgh Penguins 2 Stanley Cups, well, then why didn't they beat Washington last night? Why is Pittsburgh out? There's no conspiracy here. There just isn't one. The Chicago Blackhawks, they won 3 Stanley Cups because they built a fantastic team. The Kings won 2 Stanley Cups. First one because of Jonathan Quick. Second one because they just played really, really well throughout the playoffs. There are a lot of teams that I could point out have won Stanley Cups. Carolina got hot at the right time, and they won their Stanley Cup in 2006. Tampa was a great team in 2004. They were first overall, and they deserved that Stanley Cup. I think they were first overall that year. They were close. If they weren't first overall, they were really close. But that's my point. How many of these franchises can you look at and say, hey, they should have had a Stanley Cup win? 2007, when they got owned by Anaheim? No. Any of the Stanley Cup finals for the Canucks? I would argue 94. Man, if Lafayette doesn't hit that crossbar. But he did. And so they're on the board. All right, there you go. There's the annual Let's Discuss Why Canada Doesn't Win Stanley Cups. Let's hope Winnipeg shuts everybody up this year. But if they don't, it's still not a conspiracy. It's not there. It doesn't exist. The NHL didn't say, hey, you guys should hire John Ferguson Jr. Wink. That didn't happen. There's a lot of mismanagement to go around. And how many of these teams get the really big name free agents and have had the number 1 draft picks and the prime players? And that's part of it too. But that's all for another video. That's it for this for now. Thanks for watching. Hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And I'm not discussing anything more regarding just why Canada doesn't win, because it's crazy. Thanks for watching. I'll talk to you again soon.